Hi, everyone. It's Nick here from Conservation Careers, and welcome to the podcast. Now, how can storytelling help to tackle some of the biggest issues of our time, like climate change and biodiversity loss? And what role can migratory birds play, like swans and ospreys? To talk about these issues and many more is today's guest, Sacha Dench. Now, Sacha is the CEO of Conservation Without Borders, which organises inspiring expeditions following the paths of migratory birds along the lines of both geographical and political borders. And by displaying the flyways from the air, land and sea, they help to highlight the importance of collective action in the fight against climate change and biodiversity collapse. Now, Sacha is an adventurer, a conservationist, a champion freediver, and is known as the human swan for her paramotor journey in 2016, following the Bewick swans migration from the Russian Arctic all the way to the UK. And we spoke to her in the final days before her latest expedition from the UK through Europe and into Africa, charting the flight of the Osprey and the impacts of climate change on migratory birds. In this episode, we talk about the realities of climate change and the importance of storytelling and communications for conservation, and how to stay hopeful and optimistic for the future. Sacha also shares her inspiring career so far, along with her top advice for people like you who might be seeking to follow in her footsteps. It's a wide-ranging, enjoyable, and really eye-opening chat. Enjoy.
I'm Sacha Dench. I'm CEO of Conservation Without Borders, a charity which I founded in 2019. And I'm UN Ambassador for the Convention on Migratory Species, also known as the human swan.
Welcome to the podcast. Thanks for joining, Sacha. Nice to be chatting today. So there's loads I'd like to talk to you about. I'd love to know more about Conservation Without Borders. I'd like to know more about the expeditions that you run. You've got such an interesting role and an interesting organization. Your career path too. But I thought maybe we could start the conversation just by talking briefly about climate change. It's something obviously really close to your heart and something you're seeking to tackle through your organization. And for the listeners, we're in July 2022. We've just had the hottest day on record ever in the UK on Tuesday, and we had to move this discussion because of that. We were meant to be talking on Tuesday when it's super hot. I just couldn't. I've been roasted alive here in my little garden office, so we've moved it to nice, cool Friday morning. And it shows climate change is happening. It's a real thing. It's something that we're being affected by here in the UK and across the globe. And it's real, right?
Yeah, it's real. There is a difference, however, between looking at charts and listening to scientists and reading papers and understanding it's real to really feeling that it's real. And I think that's been a really interesting and eye-opening thing for me. For years, I'm originally a scientist. For years, I've been aware that climate change was a thing. We were in it. But I had a really interesting, different view of it after flying, which we haven't spoken about yet, obviously, but I flew from the Russian Arctic back to the UK with migrating swans. And that was starting in August up in the Arctic and flying over, some of the wildest parts of the world. But obviously in the Arctic, they're feeling climate change pretty strongly. So I asked a group of ninnets, the nomadic reindeer breeders, once, what would you say to people who don't believe in climate change? And they rolled around on the floor, laughing, saying, you're supposed to be the educated Westerners. How can you not see this? Because for them, it means the tundra is now not freezing all the way to the surface. So that when on their migrations, they stop places where they use pits they've dug to keep food cold. So they slaughter a reindeer and they keep it cold. That's no longer frozen when they get to at their normal time. So at one point they fished around in this kind of big hole in the ground in a pot, which was basically reindeer blood for some piece of meat, and they were quite rotten. And they said, look, sorry, it's safe to eat like this. And apparently it is safe to eat raw, rotten reindeer meat. But it wouldn't normally have been this warm. It would have been colder. So they apologized for that, but they just said it's just not freezing as it used to. Also, my expedition was almost stopped because there was, again, with tundra thawing, it's now thawing, the permafrost is thawing so low that it had released some old carcasses of reindeer that had died of anthrax. And so suddenly there was an anthrax outbreak for them, and it killed a small boy, and it caused the evacuation of a few villages. So it's another example of it being really real. And on the tundra, on the edges, there's whole like land collapses due to it. And up in the Arctic, that's one thing. If you're basically staying on the edge of a small island and that island is getting smaller, that's one thing. But there's also a lot of oil and kind of gas pipelines that cross the Arctic. And so their big fear is the tundra collapses underneath one of the supports that raises those pipelines off the ground, and the pipes break, and that basically pollutes all of the tundra that they're kind of grazing land for cattle. And that's not something that happens every now and then. That's quite a frequent occurrence for them. So for them, all of these things are very, very real. And so, yeah, spending time with people for whom who are on the extremes and are feeling it already very strongly. It also means for them that, they can't get tourists out on ATVs, because you can't drive an ATV out on the tundra if it's not fully frozen. They just won't have it. You will tear up the tundra, and it will again destroy the habitat. So for them, there are less and less people can come out for them to earn any kind of tourism money. It's also supplies in emergency that can't get to them. They have to do those long journeys just on reindeer again. So yeah, for them it is very, very real. So, and then obviously looking at a journey like that through the eyes of the swans, we just repeatedly saw how even changes in the weather were affecting them. So more frequent storms. If you're a 12-week-old juvenile swan and you're on your first kind of epic migration, more frequent storms, and you're also being chased by a frozen winter that's constantly on your tail. I could see from a sort of bird's eye view how that was constantly affecting them. We can go into that in more detail if you like, but it was just interesting to see in other parts of the world how very, very real it was for this just survival of different people, but also looking at it through the eyes of a bird.
Yeah, and just how quickly things are changing, within, recent human life terms, we can kind of see those changes and experience them. Yeah, so you're talking about the Flight of the Swans expedition that you did a few years back now. Before we go into that, I'd love to talk about that properly. Can you just paint more of a picture then? What is Conservation Without Borders? What is the organisation? What are you seeking to tackle? How do you go about doing that?
So I guess a key thing that I wanted to do was, after being made ambassador for migratory species, because of the flight of the osprey, the flight of the swans, I didn't really go into the sort of point of the flight of the swans. It was more just the climate change question. And actually, I probably feel like I should elaborate slightly more on this point that I made right at the very beginning about the difference between climate change being something that you know about intellectually. There's those that pretend it's not happening completely. There's one thing you know about intellectually. It's another to see it through the eyes of somebody else, or then to really feel it. And then, so I think the really stark thing for me was a couple of years ago. I actually grew up in the Australian outback in the southeast, predominantly in the southeast corner of Australia, where our family home is. And yeah, I had the really unpleasant experience of being out in Australia with my mum, with yet another load of bushfires on their way towards the place. And we fought bushfires before. My mum was in the Royal Fire Brigade. She was driving the trucks. And we were looking at the fire risk and pumped 120,000 litres of water into 3 massive tanks. So we were well prepared for it. And then had to look at the scale of the fire that was approaching us and sit down and go, God, this is not a fire like any that we've seen before. The head of the fire brigade just told everybody, even the fire brigade, don't be there. He wasn't going to try and defend his house. He said, this is not on a scale we can fight. It was far longer, the fire front. It moved far faster than even the speediest predictions where we were. And it wasn't just a fire front that you were fighting. It was ended up being like 11 kilometers tall, because the fire front connected with the thunderstorm. So you got this basically a huge fire front that was throwing lightning bolts far ahead of it. So a friend of ours who did try and defend his house said that the moment he saw like fire coming over the back of the hill, which was the back of our place, the hill behind our house, he said there was no chance your house survived, because what I saw was a wall of lava. And as soon as I saw it appear, it was still about 2 kilometers away from his house. Fireballs started exploding all around him. So it wasn't a fire front I was fighting. I was fighting fire all over the place. It was like, gas in the air was just exploding as well. So his plan to sit there and defend his house, he said he just threw that out completely, got in his truck and drove into the river, and then he hid under a log in the river for just over an hour until the fire front had gone past. And he said it was the most terrifying thing of his life. So this was a fire that was like nothing else. And I think again, it was a moment where you really feel what climate change means, how it affects ordinary people, because it affected us. And then you can also see from that how once changes start happening, there is a bit of a snowball. So once one sort of extreme event happens, you expose yourself to more extreme events. So in our case in the southeast, that was extreme rains came not long afterwards. And because lots of the big old trees had been completely burned, our house burnt at more than, I think, 1400 degrees. It melted any kind of gold or silver that was anywhere. There was nothing left pretty much. So it killed a load of the old trees. So when the extreme rains came, they washed mud and everything down into the river, and that washed away the 3 or 4 of the main bridges that lead anyone out to where we are. So there was no option then to try and start rebuilding or anything for a long time, because that had to all be sorted. And we'd had sort of serious decimation of the wildlife as well. And that has been a really interesting thing to hear reports from my mum slowly coming in about all that changing, how slow the wildlife has been to come back. So I think what I've tried to paint is this picture of, climate change is real, but it's very different. Some people will say that you don't know something is. Some people won't want to believe it until a piece of the sky falls on their head, or you won't want to believe the sky is falling until a piece of it falls on your head. And that's, I think, definitely what it is for me. So it's one thing for me to be talking climate change, and now to really be prepared to put some skin in the game and kind of see there's nothing else really that matters. That's kind of where I feel at the moment. And
that's where the driving passion is coming from through Conservation Without Borders, and why you've got the skin in the game. So for people that don't know what Conservation Without Borders is, what is it then? Obviously, it's seeking to tackle climate change and raise awareness of some of these issues, but how do you go about doing that? For the people who don't know, what is it?
So what I really liked about the journey with swans was that it gave us a chance to stop and land and talk to a lot of people. Obviously, for those who don't know, I was flying that in a paramotor, so it's a tiny hanging off a paraglider with the propeller on your back, so you can take off on flat land and you can stop and land anywhere. It gave me a chance to speak to a lot of people. It gave us a chance to highlight some of the work that people were doing, so solutions people had found in different countries. We were flying across, many different countries, languages and cultures, but we had a chance to film stories with people and showcase solutions that maybe people in other parts of the flyway had a similar problem but weren't aware of the same sort of solutions. Things like collisions with power lines, how to avoid birds colliding with power lines, for example. It gave us a chance it basically raised a lot of public awareness. Media were incredibly interested particularly in kind of crazy lady trying to be a bird. So we got lots of media attention, and once you have public coming down to visit you, media attention as well, suddenly the politicians are interested. So we had doors opening to politicians that weren't open to us previously. We're talking about a bird. In reality, you help a bird like the swan, and you're helping all the other birds that are doing the same migration, that are using the same wetlands for them. So it opened a lot of doors. And it basically gave us a really powerful story that would open doors for years to come. And whilst a lot of us, I've struggled with it, and I can tell that story again later. I struggled a bit with the fact that humans and people in positions of power don't necessarily make decisions based purely on logic. We don't necessarily, when we're shopping, for example, if we're aiming at brands, like, for example, why would you pay more for brands but something else is just as good? We often are moved to act more by a powerful story than we are by the data. So if I really look at the journey with the swans was inspired by me sitting down with a load of researchers, and I saw they had powerful research, they had years of evidence, they had a really shocking story. The swans had declined by more than almost a half in the last 20 years, and they were still going. And you get to a point where a population is so small, it's really hard to bring it back. And there were some things they didn't know, that you needed to go places in person, but they were, really inspired people. And so, my main aim was to look at all their research, and they wanted me to help them get the right people in the right sorts of industries that were associated with the threats to the birds. That was the power industries, that was in some cases farming, it was the shooting industries. All sorts. And I looked at it and I just thought, if I can try and get people to meetings, if they're not coming to the meetings already, but I don't think that's going to work, and I don't think that's going to work fast enough. I think you need a much more powerful and emotive story. And so I looked at this journey of the swans and thought, God, that is an incredible story. You've got birds going from the land of the Arctic, from the land of the reindeer breeders and the polar bear, across the wildest kind of wetlands of the world, across the thick tiger forest, and then across Europe, where there's all kinds of development, agriculture and everything. There's castles, there's stormy weather, I'm really sorry.
It's okay.
I'm letting her know that we have to actually close that door for the audio. Thanks. So we're flying across some of the wildest parts of the world, and we know that the birds were facing all sorts of threats, increasingly stormy weather's also being shot at. That's a bit of a James Bond story. Can I somehow use that story? And I've to try and bring all these different people to the table. And I've grown up in hunting communities in Australia before, and I know there's plenty of good people in the world of hunting. You just need to get to them in the right way. And the same with lots of other industries, the same with logging industry and others. You just need to reach them in the right way. And the way that I approached it was, first of all, to have a really powerful story. And secondly, to allow them to be one of the good guys. So not to go straight in with, we know that you're part of the problem. Why aren't you doing something about it? Which is generally the normal approach. Instead, the main message for the whole expedition was, look at these incredible birds. They already do an amazing journey where they've been disappearing over the last 20 years, and we're just trying to find out why. We want to talk to all of you, and all of you have got kind of an important part of the story to tell. And that leaves it open for hunters to say, well, it might be hunters, I don't know, let's kind of look into that. And that's what we found kind of repeatedly. It wasn't always that easy, but the hunters in the Arctic, for example, my first request to them was to help me get across the Arctic. So I contacted everybody who I knew in the world of hunting logistics up in this Arctic town, and found that basically they were so inspired by this story, the idea of trying to fly in a little paramotor across the Arctic, that they were up for it. That was a challenge. That was something that they knew they could help with. And once they're all part of the expedition crew, they were then kind of by default, they were going to end up being part of the Swan Champion network, which is what exists now, where the hunters are, running the work all across the Arctic, trying to make sure that hunting tourists aren't coming in to shoot big white birds, as some of them asked to do. We basically found a different way of telling stories. I guess overall you'd describe it as looking at the kind of complex problems of the world, but through the eyes of a bird, and it gives you a really different, it really gives you a different story and a really powerful story.
And I guess there's no better story to tell than that of a migratory bird, because it connects lots of different cultures, different landscapes, different ecosystems, different people, and tells the kind of the wider issues that we want to tell about climate change, about landscape change, about all sorts of issues, about how we need to work and act internationally and across borders.
Yeah, so that's it. And it was after the flight of the Swans expedition that we lost the house in Australia. So I had a lot of kind of time with myself, figuring out, did I still feel as strongly that what we were doing, basically trying to focus on migratory species, because they're complicated to look after. They rely on people in different countries, with different levels of different sort of budgets, different focus on conservation, different habitats. It relies on lots of them all getting together. Did I still feel that was my priority if climate change was an issue? And then I just realized that the expeditions give you a really powerful tool for talking about climate change, but also to make it obvious to people that climate change and biodiversity loss are not two separate things. But with the joy, I suppose, of an expedition and a journey with the birds is that you can tell that big complex story through a whole series of different smaller stories. Yeah. And people, hopefully, that aren't already engaged, particularly in the climate story, will come along with us because they're interested in the journey, they're interested in meeting different people. And hopefully along the way, there'll be revelations that people will go, damn, I never knew that. I never really put two and two together. And realize that just how close the connection is between, say, what I buy at the supermarket and what might be impacting birds elsewhere. And the osprey, thankfully, is a bird that a lot of people love.
Yeah. So let's talk about that. So that's your next expedition that you're currently planning. It's the flight of the osprey, following the flight path from Scotland in the north of UK right down to its wintering grounds from our perspective, down in Ghana, in Africa. And so what's the plan? Where are you in the stage of planning, and how can sort of people follow and get involved?
Okay, so we are right at the crux, I suppose, of planning. We're just a few days out from all moving to our base up in the Cairngorms. So apologies if you can hear any of the noises in the background. There's lots going on. So we go up there. We've got a week of training, so where all the team will be together for the first time. There's the team from Nigeria, Canada, the Netherlands, Denmark, and the UK. So we've not met in person yet. So we've got a week of training, getting ready for an expedition across Africa, and then on the 1st of August, so just over a week away, we set off.
Wow. Fantastic. Really close then. So what's the path? How far are you looking to travel each day? What are the different roles that the team are playing to support you and anyone else that might be flying, along that journey? Just sort of paint a picture as to what this expedition looks like and the logistics involved in that.
Okay. So how far are we going? Overall, it's about 10,000 kilometers. That's if you were just doing a straight line and not kind of taking deviations. Yeah. There's 14 countries involved. So it's a kind of a visa nightmare, particularly. It's been particularly difficult getting African visas for Africans, which a lot of us maybe don't appreciate how difficult it is for some nationalities to travel. But we're fighting that all the way. We've got plenty of different countries to go to in the expedition team, so that are traveling every day. There's 9 people. 3 of them are dedicated researchers, so they are in each country. We're visiting basically a flyway for migratory birds is basically a series of wetlands that are used to stop at for the osprey. That's freshwater and coastal saltwater. So in each country we're visiting 2, maybe 3, maybe 4 different wetland sites. Some have protection, some don't have protection, and we're doing kind of a basic assessment of the state of that, so using Ramsar information sheet. So we're connecting with international data sets wherever we can, so we can add to that information. We're also doing plastic transects, so looking at the amount of plastic, but also the potential sources of the plastic as a key issue along the way. There'll be some seagrass surveys if we're in places where there's seagrass. It's a critical habitat, again, for lots of different animals. For the osprey, the seagrass is habitat for young fish. So if the seagrass is being destroyed, then we have a problem. And then there's community surveys. So we can find a lot of information from asking people that live around these sites. So that's what the research team are mostly responsible for. There's also a 3-person media crew. And so their role is to record photos and videos to make, firstly, I suppose, a film at the end of it. So it's a film that will be available for everybody along the flyway to use, available in multiple languages. They're also producing the content that we'll use to share the goings on of the expedition live throughout it. We're also making a radio series for Radio 4. So that will be 10, 15-minute pieces that will run live through the expedition with a bit of a delay, so they catch up with us at the end. So that's also really powerful. There's a certain audience that we're trying to reach for this, that actually Radio 4 is excellent for. So and the others in the ground crew will be, there's a head of logistics, and there's the medic, and there's me. So that's basically how our crew works. We're traveling in 3 Land Rovers. They've all got roof tents, primarily for times when we are camping out near wetlands and there might be hippos, so you don't want to necessarily be sleeping on the ground. And one of them is set up as a kind of camp hub. It's a camper with a basic kitchen and a sort of table that can be put out for editing on, etc. So yeah, we're moving as a crew like that, but have partners in every country who are offering support, places to stop. They're joining us for the as we travel through their country, so that we've got somebody who can speak whatever local languages we come across on the way.
It sounds so exciting. I know you're kind of in the eye of the storm right now. It's so close. You're about to be going off to Scotland and it all starts. Right, yeah. What is your hope for the expedition? What do you hope to achieve from this? What do you hope the impact is going to be?
Okay, so I guess they're on a few different levels. The first one is the more public awareness there is, and the more perceived public awareness there is from kind of governments and industry. If you think about this kind of system all working together, you basically, I try and look at a whole flyway like this kind of as a system. You've got industry, you've got the public, you've got governments all sort of working together, and I suppose I would probably put the media in there as well. So yeah, none of them can kind of suddenly make all the difference. You've got to try and work on all of them a bit at the same time. So we try and raise public awareness so that in every country people can see that actually there's an appreciation of actually what migratory species are and why they need to be protected, that we get enough media interest, that certainly the politicians and industry are also very, very aware of. So we show that there's public interest in these things. So that is, I guess that's the core of the first part of it, and gathering the positive stories. So we focus on some of the challenges to the birds, but we also focus on telling the stories of people who've got solutions. So there's like this is bad, but at every stage there is probably a solution. We either need to do a bit more of that, share that idea with other people, etc. And yeah, so that's, I guess, that's the core of the year one, the kind of expedition year. It's getting people excited about this incredible bird. And then after the expedition, we'll have a film, which we hope will be used by partners in all the countries to generate further conversation. So that's when they can use the film as a conversation starter, use it to raise awareness of the issues that there are in your country and why, say, policy might need to change, or why they would like a change of industry. But also after the expedition, we have two events planned. One of those is in Ghana. The British ambassador in Ghana is going to host an event at their private residence for heads of industry, so that we can show them a story. We can definitely talk data. We can talk data about habitat kind of loss and species loss, etc. But we'll also have powerful human stories from people. And the overall aim of that event will be a call to industry to get involved. And we'll definitely appeal to the individuals within those organizations. We need to try and kind of move their hearts rather than have them just thinking about their business goals, I suppose. All of it's got to work in one. I think more and more industries, though, people in industry are definitely seeing that a move to being more sustainable is inevitable. It's no longer, are we going to be nice enough and do this? It's like, if you don't do this, you're just not going to have an industry left. And it's getting, unfortunately, I think we're getting to a point where that's becoming more and more obvious to more and more people. So yeah, that will be an event there. And then back in the UK, we'll do similar, but talking to retailers. The major retailers have a huge influence on conservation, on the use of land, on the use of resources. So I can give you quite a tangible example in that, say, in southern Spain, there's a big wetland there, which is used by most birds on migration before they cross down into Africa. They use the narrow stretch of water at the Straits of Gibraltar. That has been drained basically by lots of illegal wells, and those wells are feeding strawberry and blueberry industry, and the vast majority of those strawberries and blueberries are all being bought by British retailers and being bought by us. So between the retailers, they have the power to encourage or discourage a whole industry like that, which could be the the difference between having a wetland there or not having a wetland there, and that affects the survival of vast numbers of species. But I think, again, we need to bring them together. And because we've got a really tangible example of, let's just look at a flyway, looking at the globe, you can still be quite distant from that story. But we're looking at a particular flyway, and we're looking at particular birds that people know they might see around them, and they're species that are also loved by their customers. So yeah, that's our key aim, I suppose.
Yeah, it's such a powerful story. And one thing that kind of makes me reflect upon is that I think more and more as conservationists, we feel like we understand the problems that are out there. I mean, often we understand the solutions too, but what we're struggling to do is to raise enough support and to get the messages out there and to bring more people into the movement. We're very good at preaching to the converted and people that are already interested, but it's reaching new people, industries that perhaps we don't feel are connected, like blueberries in Spain or other industries like that. And can you maybe talk to also David Attenborough said a year or two back that conservation is now a communications challenge, and this idea about being better at storytelling and communicating and speaking to hearts and minds and enabling action and behavior change. Could you maybe just talk to that a little bit? Like, how do you see, why is communications important in conservation, and is it, what role does it play?
Yeah, communication and understanding. So I guess there's so many different levels to that. So where exactly do I go? But I'd say I maybe can talk a bit about my initial difficult realization about the kind of science not really being the complete answer. Yeah. Years ago, I started a project looking at the shark nets off Australia. And when I first went out there, obviously I had years of kind of research experience behind me. I started looking at what the shark nets were, and they didn't make any sense to me whatsoever. They were in Australia anyway. The ones in South Africa were quite different. In Australia, they're a 100-meter strip of net, about 100 meters offshore, might be a 5-kilometer beach that has 2 of them at different ends. Like, they don't stop anything. They randomly catch stuff. They're kind of like a ghost net. Yeah. And I was pretty outraged at this idea that people were also told that this was protecting them at the beach, and it was actually just a strip offshore. But also I then got through freedom of information, I got the data on all the things that fishermen had pulled out of them because they have to be taken out and cleaned. And it was pretty outrageous. Very little of it was any species that were dangerous. So compiled all that information and tried to get that out into the media to get people to look at, actually, do we need to rethink what we do about shark netting? Couldn't hardly get any interest, almost no interest whatsoever. There'd never been a risk assessment about them as well. That wasn't of interest either. And then next thing you know, I started taking a camera out with me while I was freediving out along the nets while I was checking them. So I was then film like stuff caught in nets. And that was one thing. Suddenly there was some interest in that. And then I became Australian freediving champion. And Australia reveres sports people, and was on 60 Minutes, etc. And suddenly everybody wanted to know what I thought about shark nets. And they didn't necessarily care whether I was a biologist or how much data I had at all. They were just interested in my opinion as a sports person. And I initially was outraged at this. It actually made me angry as a scientist. Like, how dare you give this prime time on television, but you didn't when I had data. And then I kind of took a long, hard look at myself and thought, actually, like this, it makes no sense to try and fight the fact that they know what's going to get a big audience. If I've got now a route to getting the attention of a big audience, why would I fight that? And why not just use that? Right. And so that was, again, I'm sure a lot of scientists really, really struggle to come to terms with that being a reality. So I think I've now sort of, over my career, I've moved it around a bit and sort of thought, in whatever I do, you have to do something basically that's got to grab people's attention. You've got to keep it long enough to give them some information without them turning away and going, oh, no, you're telling me something uncomfortable. Because those that are interested in that already, they're not really my prime interest. We want to get to those people that are not. But then we also want to give them something that they can do, something positive, and also leave them not in a state of despair, but as much optimism as possible. And I suppose that's what we now tried to do with everything. I've had a kind of long career which did move from science more and more into communications, because I realized actually that wasn't, I thought at the beginning when I started to realize I was kind of in PR, and I thought that also sounded like a horrible thing to do. But actually, like, communication of conservation really, really is, I would say also it's everything. But in communicating it, there's so many different skills that are needed. So I guess the key thing that I try and get across to people is actually in pretty much any career you're in, you could be a conservationist, you could be driving it. And we've got a lot of ecologists in conservation. I'm not sure we need any more. We know a lot of data. I mean, there's some people who are definitely going to be, ecologists. They want to be scientists and they're destined for that. But we definitely need more lawyers. We need more inspiring conservationists. We need, people in with a real kind of hard nose for advertising. How do you manipulate the way that people think? How do you make them buy stuff they don't really need and spend lots of money on it? The same sort of thought process that goes in that. How to make people do something that doesn't logically make sense for them to do. How do we make them do that? All that kind of skill. If we had that all put towards putting the world to rights, changing the way our agricultural systems and all the rest of it, then we'd be winning. I think we've got enough ecology. We really, really, really do know quite a lot. Maybe not at the detail level, but we need a lot of other people and a lot of other skills to come on board.
Yeah, that's a great insight. I'd like to ask a couple of follow-up questions off that, and if I can, I'm conscious of time, so I'm going to try and squeeze a few things in. I know you're a very busy lady. One, can you just paint a bit of a picture of your career path to date, prior to Conservation Without Borders? What different roles have you played that have been quite important to you to get into where you are now? And the other is, like, what advice would you give people out there who are looking to also create impact in the world as a conservationist or something else? Have you got some advice you'd like to share from your career story?
Okay, let me start off with the first bit. You might have to remind me of the second one.
Yep.
So I guess I, as a youngster, my main skills, I suppose, were science and math. That's what I was good at. So I was always kind of encouraged to do something in that general realm. I realized that actually I really, really wanted to be outdoors. So I ended up, I guess, I chose biology and genetics as a initial career.
Yeah.
I then worked in South America. I worked as an assistant because I spoke a couple of languages by that time. By chance, I guess that was really handy. I worked in South America for a bit with an anthropologist, and that, I suppose, that gave me a bit of another insight into different elements of ecology. We were going and interviewing people who'd received lots of development funding for environmental type projects, and we went to look at how the money had been used to try and write a kind of rule book for what's a good and a bad way of handling these big projects in the future. In some places we weren't very welcome because, well, for various reasons, but it definitely was an insight, and I was volunteering on that role, so it definitely gave me lots of insights into different ways conservation works around the world. Then I came back to the UK for on a fast track graduate scheme in the Environment Agency, and that allowed me to kind of quickly move between different places. Realized that working in a regulator probably wasn't the best place for me, because I wanted to push boundaries a bit further, and if something didn't make sense for me, I didn't want to do it. And so I guess in the government systems often can move quite slowly, but it did at least give me an insight into how things work. And so I'd say I kind of moved around like that. I worked for a science PR agency while I was at uni for a while, and then I worked for, I guess the next most critical one was working for Australian Geographic. So it's a magazine, but also there's a trust that funds conservation and adventure work combined. So maybe that was a key element in my key part of my journey. But alongside that work, I'd always done things that were quite adventurous. So I guess I'd started freediving by that time. And so once I was a skilled freediver, I realized actually I competed for Australia and for Britain. I was really good at it, but it didn't bring me enough joy in life. There was a lot of time spent putting it all together. I wanted to use the skill, not necessarily get more points or more medals. Using that skill, and then I guess guess the story that I mentioned earlier, realizing that once you had that, once you got a name for yourself as a sports person, that actually opened lots of conservation doors, which was interesting. And so, yeah, working at Australian Geographic, that was lots of time spent thinking about words and storytelling and how you engage people, because that's going out to a broad audience. And then, so I guess from there is where I started moving more and more into conservation communications. So the next, I suppose, key role was one for Landcare Australia. I was director of PR and comms. And again, that sounds it sounds bad to the Sacha that was early 20s and wanted to be saving the world environmentally, but PR at that level was really, it was telling the story of 6,000 volunteer groups who were all out there trying to do good work. Yeah. And I just realized that was where my forte was. There was plenty of people who were better scientists, I think, than me, but I could see a story that would attract attention and attract funds. And so from there, I then ended up working at WWT, based up at Slimbridge.
Which is the Wildfowl and Wetlands Trust, yeah.
It is, yeah, which I thought was the Wildlife and Wetland Trust. And if I'm to be honest with everybody, I having worked on turtles and sharks and all sorts in Australia, realizing then that I was head of PR for ducks, geese and swans, which for me sounded like domestic animals. They would hate me to say that. I then struggled for a while thinking, gosh, how am I going to make these exciting? And then I had a moment up at Clavrock in Scotland where I was taking the one show out and the head warden said, get down. And 25,000 geese flew over our head at about 10 meters. And I was filming at the time and all my footages just got expletive over the top of it because it was so inspiring, so awesome.
Yeah, power of nature, yeah.
Yeah, and then I realized, actually, I can really see how this works. And then, I suppose 10 years working for the Wildfowl and Wetland Trust, I worked on a lot of different species, a lot of different projects, and found different ways of really finding a hook, finding something that would reach ordinary people to get their attention. And through WWT, I got interested in the whole stories of migration, and so the Flight of the Swans was done with WWT, and that has steered my whole path in a new direction.
Gosh, it's been a ride so far. Yeah, you've done so much. You can sort of hear the various strands sort of slowly coming together to meet where you currently are, through science, engagement in conservation, communications, then migratory birds, WWT, and obviously where you are now. Well, I won't ask what have you learned. So what advice would you offer other people who are listening then, who are inspired by your work and would love to follow in your footsteps? They might be at university right now, or they might be just working in another industry and looking to kind of apply their skills and knowledge into conservation.
Okay, so I guess if you did ask kind of what I've learned, I suppose I've learned that the way that I like to work is to step back and look at a whole system and see how does that system work, try and understand that as best I can, and then try and see which bits of that I could manipulate to go in the direction we want to go, and who else could help. That's a really important thing. So that's generally the way that I work. What advice would I have people who are already in conservation? So I guess I was really struggling as in my early 20s with exactly what, where should I go? What should I do? And then I realized actually I was just going to go with my heart and do things which actually really didn't necessarily make sense to my parents. They didn't necessarily seem like the most financially sensible decisions to do. But if the idea or the opportunity really inspired me for some reason, I was going to follow it, and I was going to do that until I was 30, and then I'd have it all sorted, and then I'd know what my career was. I definitely knew a lot more about myself by the time I was 30. So I'm very happy I made that choice. And I guess though there was a moment I had flying across the Russian Arctic where the next place I knew I was going to be landing in a hunting community. I knew nothing about them. They didn't have an airplane service into them. They had no idea necessarily that I was coming unless they'd heard it on the radio. But I was flying across this kind of vast wilderness, and I realized I was in my absolute element. I had just different different parts of me were all coming together. So I had the skills, the things I was really good at. I'd obviously learned to fly paramotors. Yeah. I was comfortable from living in the Australian bush, etc., with meeting random people. Spending enough time learning languages, I'd learned very basic Russian, just enough that people didn't feel threatened by me. I would say a few words, and we had Google Translate on my phone and things. And yeah, I was pretty confident that I could look after myself for a few days at a time if I ended up on my own. But I realized I was in my absolute element, where I thought my kind of the things that I thought were important in the world, the ideas that I'm passionate about, but also where my skills are, were all overlapping. So I was kind of felt like I was just doing what I was supposed to do. Yeah. And what I was doing for many other people would have just sounded horrific. And I've had people say, oh God, seeing pictures of where I was, for example, or where I was going, saying, God, that must be awful for you. And I was like, actually, really? Because that looks to me like heaven.
Yeah.
So I think I've just been really honest with myself about where what my skills are, what things I'm passionate, which things I'm really passionate about, but also that logically, I think actually this does make sense. Mm-hmm. So I would say that to other people: find out that kind of sweet spot for you. What fires you up? What do you think is important, and where are your skills? And also keep developing that skill pool, because that gives you more and more opportunity. Yeah. And then people in other industries, I'd say anybody in any industry could be a conservationist. We really need all people. I mean, obviously in our conversation so far, I've mentioned all the different industries, so I rely very much on the advice of lawyers, not only for kind of expeditions and putting it together, but also in kind of our interactions with foreign governments, etc. Mm-hmm. Lawyers are important. People in all stages of industry. It only takes one person in a company to start something that they think can then snowball. If you can get enough people to support it, you can, like, the whole culture within a company can change, where actually suddenly everybody's up for trying a shift in how they do business. So I'd say, just have a long, hard look. If you're in HR, there's ways that you can shift your kind of company culture as well. So yeah, I'd say just really look at what you do and how you do it, and figure out how you can assist with conservation. We've also got people on our board of trustees. I really needed an HR expert, and we've got one now. So yeah, offer your services to people as well. If you can't find ways within your company, there'll be charities and other organizations out there. Find one that inspires you and offer to help, and they might just bite your arm off.
Yeah, there's just loads of good advice in that. I love that. I love the idea of following your passion, finding your own particular sweet spot, and also from anyone can be a conservationist, no matter what role you're doing. You can all make a difference, either in your current role or by transferring into another. Yeah, and I think for you, particularly in terms of your sweet spot, it's quite a specific niche sweet spot, but you found your happy place and where you're making your impact. And a big part of that, it seems to me, is through innovation. Through that, your job wasn't available. You made your job. You made your role. You made your career, and you're kind of making that impact through that.
Yeah, and a lot of people, I think I also have realized that the power of a good idea. If you find a good idea, not all my good ideas have actually ever worked, but I will constantly test them on people. So be open to, if you've got an idea, be open to criticism, because the criticism you get is the way that you hone an okay idea into a great idea. And I haven't been scared of throwing ideas out there and just seeing which ones light other people up. And then when you're on a good one, that's something that you can either start, whether that's something within a company or a new initiative.
Yeah. And I guess therefore not being afraid of failure too. If it doesn't work, move on, keep learning. Yeah.
Yeah.
Fantastic. Well, we are slightly over time. I'd love to ask you a couple more questions if I can. We asked our audience before the podcast what they would like to ask you, and I got a couple of questions here I'd like to pitch. Karina asked, I'd like to ask Sacha where she found most resistance in her work and some of the reasons for it. And then she said, what I mean is, what sectors and what kind of people are the least open to her mission? What would you say to Karina about that?
Ooh, wow, there's different missions. The most resistance. God, in some ways, I would even say conservation. Conservation. So I think it took a while. If we even look at within WWT, there is, there was a section of people who would have looked at a radical idea like flying with the swans from the Russian Arctic to the UK, and who would have looked at their kind of book of how you do conservation, and that wouldn't have fit into anybody's book. Yeah. So I would say it was only because I had years of working with people and seeing that I think outside the box. But when I think outside the box, quite often it works, and that I'm open to, again, being open to talk about it or change tack if something isn't working. So I think there's I had a lot of reputation building kind of that I had to do there. But yeah, conservation can be quite conservative. Yeah. In the ways that it wants to do work. And there's a lot of scientists that I would say still struggle with this idea that the public, they just need to be given more data, or governments just need to be given more data, and then they will make rational decisions. They really have got to see that actually that's quite often not the case. So yeah, I would say that was a weirdly and key one. When I first drafted a one-pager on the flight of the swans, I sent it to somebody within WWT, two ladies, Julia and Eileen, and the response I got back was, "This is totally bonkers, but it's so bonkers it might just work. Let's have a coffee." And then they sent it off to all the researchers across the flyway, and the response was generally the same, but mostly because it was 20 years of people pulling their hair out and thinking, God, why isn't this working? We've got so much data. We've got an action plan. Why isn't this working? And so they were also at a point where they were so desperate. They were like, it might just work. We're prepared to give it a go. So yeah, I unfortunately would say, I think conservationists, there's definitely plenty of, I think in the commercial world, you call it blue ocean thinking. That's kind of whole areas where you're not necessarily competing with anyone else because you're creating a new industry. I feel like conservation has got vast amounts of that. We are so focused on a kind of ecology research, gathering data, proving there's a problem. There's still massive new areas to go in finding new ways of solving things.
Again, it comes back to that word innovation. I think, yeah, gosh, I could talk to you all day about this stuff, but we haven't got all day. So final question from me then is from Patricia, actually, in our community. She says, how do you, Sacha, keep positive with your outlook in the face of so many challenges and diminishing wildlife? I guess, why, are you optimistic for the future, and how do you stay positive? A follow-up from Patricia says, I struggle with this for the ocean and have good and bad days. She would love tips on how to deal with the down days. How do you stay positive?
Okay, so one of my ways of dealing with it is quite shocking. So I'll tell you, I'll leave that to the end. I stay positive by constantly looking at seeking out people who've got solutions. Mm-hmm. So that's a key thing for me. I think there are plenty of examples of how things are changing fast. Our shift towards renewables is happening quite fast, etc. And so I definitely keep myself positive by hunting out those positive stories. I guess one of the other ways, and it was part of our sort of message for the last expedition, which was trying to fly around Britain in an electric paramotor. The key message for that was sort of Britain drove the Industrial Revolution. Could we drive the Green Revolution too? And that was based on the fact that if you look back in history, like since the Industrial Revolution, we've changed the world so fast that it's almost unbelievable. And today we've got better technology, better communications. Our world is far better connected. I don't really see any reason why we couldn't, if we really chose to, why we couldn't shift the whole way we function in a new direction way faster. So I think that physically it is actually possible. I also have to have a list of all the things I suppose that have inspired me over time, and I look back at that. So people some of them are just people who I can see that I've changed. Like somebody who's got a lot of power, I've changed their perception on something quite rapidly. So I keep reminding myself that actually I have had power, even that helps you through some of the failures. So yeah, the Industrial Revolution, seeing that as one of my inspirations is a bit shocking. The other is in the grand scheme of things, like nature and the laws of physics, the laws of nature are so much bigger than us. And actually, whatever we do over time, nature will eventually prevail. So the forces are way bigger than us. So it's not a very positive story for us necessarily in our story on the planet, but in the grand scheme of things, the world tends to complexity and biodiversity, because that's how you get a kind of stable ecology. So it will end up at that again. We might have just been a kind of quite a shocking species to have appeared for a time, but that, I guess, because my main interest is kind of the ecology and the way that things work. I focus on the big picture much more than, I suppose, individual animals, for example. Yeah. I find some sort of solace in that when I feel really bad. When we sit there and we look at headlines and headlines and headlines of fires across Europe, the Arctic, Australia, the US, there are really miserable moments. And when I look at that, I then go back to the really big picture and go, God, in the end, nature will prevail. Yeah.
Nature will win. Yeah. And on that very optimistic, positive, hopeful message, I think that's a really good place to be wrapping up. Thank you so much, Sacha. It's been really nice getting to talk to you. I could genuinely talk all day to you, but I wish you all the very best with this expedition that's coming down the road so soon. Thanks for sharing your valuable time with us at this particularly busy moment. If people want to find out more about you, and particularly about Flight the Ospreys and everything that's just about to happen, where should they go? Where should we send them?
Conservation Without Borders online and on all the socials.
Yeah, fantastic. Good luck. Have a safe journey. I hope it goes well. We'll be watching with great interest.
Thanks very much.
Okay. Well, I hope you enjoyed that, everyone. If you did, then please do hit the subscribe button to get notified of new episodes as they drop. And also, please give us a rating or a review, because it really helps us to get in front of more people. Now, if you want our help to get clear and get started and get hired as a professional conservationist, I recommend you enroll in our free online training program, exploring how to get a conservation job. So if you're a student, a job seeker, or a career switcher, you'll learn the golden rule about how to get started, the key mistakes to avoid, and also we'll answer your biggest questions. You can check that out at conservation-careers.com/free. See you soon.